On a Saturday morning in Atlanta, a store manager had security follow a father and his 7-year-old daughter through 3 floors of designer racks, certain the man in the faded gray jacket was casing his store for a theft. He had no idea the man's name was already on the deed downstairs. He was wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The doors of Kestrel in Maine opened at 9, and Marcus Bell walked through them holding his daughter's hand, like he had done 100 times before. Nia bounced on her toes in the marble lobby, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, already scanning the directory for the children's department. She had turned 7 3 days earlier, and the birthday dress had become a kind of sacred mission between them, discussed over cereal, sketched on the back of a school worksheet, negotiated down from sequins to something with a little less shine and a little more twirl. Marcus wore a plain gray jacket, soft at the elbows from wear, the kind of coat that had seen more winters than fashion seasons. In its left pocket, worn smooth by years of his thumb passing over it, sat a brass tape measure. It had belonged to his father. He did not think about it consciously most mornings. It was simply there, the way a wedding ring is there, the way a scar is there, a small weight against his ribs that meant something only he could name. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not wear a name tag. Nothing about him announced who he was, and that was exactly how he had always wanted it. A man could learn more about his own store standing in line at the register than he ever could behind a desk on the top floor, and Marcus Bell had built his life on paying attention to the things other men walked past. Nia tugged him toward the escalator. "Can we go to the dresses first? Please, Daddy?" "That's the plan, baby." Above them, on the mezzanine that overlooked the atrium, Weston Calloway stood with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the floor the way he watched it every Saturday morning, like a general surveying a battlefield he had personally fortified. Calloway had run the flagship store for 6 years, and in that time he had built a reputation among the regional office for tight numbers and a clean shrink report. He liked to say he protected the brand. He said it in meetings. He said it to his staff. He had once said it to a magazine writer doing a small piece on holiday retail security, and the phrase had lodged itself in him so deeply that he no longer noticed how much weight he put behind the word protect, or how little behind the word brand. His eyes moved across the floor out of habit, the way another man's eyes might move across a crossword. Young mother with a stroller, no concern. 2 women in workout clothes comparing scarves, no concern. Then his gaze snagged on the man in the gray jacket walking hand in hand with a little girl toward the escalator, and something in Calloway's chest tightened the way it always did. A small, cold click of recognition that had nothing to do with anything the man had actually done. He lifted the radio from his belt. "Roy, you on the floor?" Roy Voss, the store's chief of security, answered within seconds, a voice thick with the particular calm of a man who had spent 20 years in mall corridors and hospital hallways before this. "Go ahead." "Gray jacket, coming up the east escalator now. Got a kid with him. Keep an eye on him for me." "Copy that. Anything specific?" Calloway watched Marcus step off the escalator, watched him glance briefly at the men's floor directory, unhurried, comfortable, a man who clearly knew exactly where he was going. To Calloway, that certainty read as something else entirely. A man who knew a store that well without ever having shopped there in Calloway's memory was a man worth watching. That was how he would have explained it to anyone who asked, if anyone had ever asked him to explain himself, which in 6 years, nobody had. "Nothing specific," Calloway said into the radio. "Just a feeling. Stay loose, stay close." Roy Voss had heard that phrase more times than he could count, and had learned long ago that arguing with it cost him more than simply doing his job and letting the shift end quietly. He clipped the radio back to his belt and started walking. Marcus led Nia past the perfume counters, the air there thick and sweet. A dozen competing scents layered over each other until they became one indistinct cloud. Nia wrinkled her nose and laughed, pressing her face briefly into her father's sleeve to escape it. He smelled like cedar and the inside of his truck, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with home. "Which floor is it?" she asked. 3. Kids' formal wear. "Is that fancy?" "Fancy enough for a birthday girl." She grinned up at him, gap where a tooth had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. And for a moment the store around them fell away into the simple geometry of a father and a daughter on an ordinary errand. That was the version of the morning Marcus had woken up expecting. He had not expected the second escalator ride to feel different from the first. A faint prickle at the back of his neck. The kind of awareness that 6 years of walking through his own buildings unannounced had taught him to trust, without needing to turn around and confirm it. He did not turn around. He kept walking, kept his voice light for his daughter's sake, and let his eyes do the work instead, catching the reflection of a gray uniform shirt in the glass of a jewelry case as they passed the second-floor landing. Roy Voss was 30 feet back, matching their pace with the practiced patience of a man who had followed 100 people through 100 stores and never once been thanked for the accuracy of his instincts. He did not think of himself as unkind. He thought of himself as thorough. Calloway paid him to be thorough, and thoroughness, in the language of the store's training manual, meant watching anyone who did not fit the pattern of the floor. They crossed into Home Goods on the second floor, a shortcut Marcus knew from 100 inventory walkthroughs he had done in clothes not unlike the ones he wore now, and the guard adjusted his path to follow, radio crackling low against his hip. Nia noticed the sound before she noticed the man. She always had good ears, sharper than her father's in some ways, tuned to the particular texture of things that did not belong. She slowed. "Daddy?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, the kind reserved for secrets and things that frightened her. She tugged his sleeve, glancing back over her shoulder at the man in the gray shirt who had, for the 3rd time, changed direction exactly when they did. "Why are they following us?" Marcus felt the question land somewhere under his ribs, a small, specific ache that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the fact that his daughter, 7 years old, 3 days into being 7, had already learned to notice what he had spent a lifetime learning to carry without flinching. He did not answer right away. He did not want his voice to carry anything sharp enough for her to hold on to. "I don't know, baby," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, because he suspected exactly why, and the suspicion sat in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. They reached the escalator to the 3rd floor, and behind them Roy Voss slowed his own steps just enough to let the distance between them look casual to anyone glancing over, though anyone watching closely would have seen exactly what Nia had seen. Marcus reached the top step and steered his daughter gently by the shoulder toward a rack of dresses near the fitting rooms, bright fabric catching the overhead light, sequins and tulle in a dozen shades of the little girl's favorite colors. He did not look back at the guard. He did not reach for his phone, did not raise his voice, did not do anything that might have given the moment more weight than he was willing to hand it. He simply reached into his coat pocket, out of habit more than need, and let his fingers rest against the cool brass edge of his father's old tape measure. The one thing in that store that had traveled with him longer than the building itself had stood on that corner. Behind him, the radio on Roy Voss's belt crackled again. Calloway's voice low and clipped through the static, asking for an update on the man in the gray jacket now that he had reached the fitting rooms with the child. Nia had barely reached the second dress on the rack, a pale yellow one with a sash she wanted to touch but did not dare, when a second guard stepped into the gap between the fitting rooms and the aisle, arms folded, blocking the exit before Marcus had even chosen anything. Weston Calloway crossed the floor with the unhurried stride of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. He stopped 3 feet from Marcus, close enough that a small line of shoppers waiting for the register slowed their conversations to watch. Close enough that a mother near the shoe display pulled her own son half a step back without thinking about why. "Sir, I need you to open that bag for me." Calloway kept his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "For everyone's comfort." Marcus looked at him, unhurried, and said nothing for a moment. The bag in question held nothing but a folded scarf he had picked up for his sister's birthday 20 minutes earlier, receipt still tucked inside the handle loop, plainly visible if anyone had cared to look. Nobody had looked. Calloway had decided what the bag contained before Marcus had even reached the second floor. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his tone even, no heat in it at all. "I just want to make sure you can actually afford what's in that bag." Calloway said it loud enough for the line at the register to hear. Loud enough that a woman near the perfume counter turned fully around. Loud enough that the words would sit in that room long after he had walked away from them. A murmur moved through the small crowd, uncomfortable. Half of it directed at Marcus and half of it, quieter, at Calloway himself. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not explain who he was, did not reach for a wallet to produce anything, did not so much as let his jaw tighten in front of his daughter. He simply set the bag on the counter beside them, unzipped it himself, and laid the scarf out flat with the receipt on top of it, folding back the tissue paper with the same careful, unhurried motion his father had once used to lay out a bolt of wool before a customer. A young woman had frozen at the register 2 lanes over, her hand still resting on the receipt printer. Her name tag read Renee Castillo, and she had worked the 3rd floor for a year and a half, long enough to know exactly what this looked like, and exactly what it would cost her to say so out loud in front of her store manager. She glanced at Roy Voss, then at Calloway, then at the little girl now pressing herself into her father's leg, and she said nothing. Her hand tightened on the counter's edge, the only part of her willing to protest. It happens to almost everyone at some point. That particular flavor of fear that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with being small in a room full of people who are bigger, louder, and certain of themselves. A child at a school assembly called out by name for something she did not do. A patient in a waiting room made to explain over and over a diagnosis that was never in question. The stomach drops before the mind can even name what is happening, and the body remembers it long after the moment has passed. Nia was 7 years old, and she had just learned what that felt like from the inside. The static on Roy Voss's radio cracked again behind them, sharp and sudden, and Nia flinched at the sound. She pressed her face against the rough wool of her father's jacket, right where the tape measure sat in his pocket, and breathed in the small, ordinary smell of him underneath the newer smell of leather bags and department store carpet that suddenly felt like something closing in around her. Her hand found the hem of his coat and gripped it, the way she used to grip the bars of her crib, small knuckles white, eyes fixed on nothing. Marcus felt her tremble against his leg, and something in his chest went very still and very cold, colder than anything Calloway's voice had managed to reach. He crouched just lightly, one hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, and said nothing to the man standing over them. He did not need to. His silence did more work in that moment than any sentence could have, and everyone watching, whether they understood it yet or not, felt the shape of it settle over the small crowd like a held breath. Above them, mounted in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, the store's overhead camera turned its quiet, unblinking eye toward the register, recording the scarf, the receipt, the little girl's face buried in gray wool, and every word that had just left Weston Calloway's mouth, exactly as it had been recorded on every camera in that building for 6 years running. Calloway snatched the receipt off the counter, glanced at it for less than a second, and dropped it back down in front of Marcus without a word of apology. "We'll be watching the rest of your visit," he said, already turning away, Roy Voss falling into step a pace behind him, radio still crackling low against his hip, as the two of them disappeared back into the crowd Calloway had gathered without ever noticing he had gathered it, leaving Marcus alone with his daughter, a scarf, and a store that had no idea whose name was written at the bottom of its own lease. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks earlier, the kitchen light had still been the color of early winter, thin and gray through the blinds, when Marcus sat on a low stool with Nia between his knees and worked her hair into 2 careful braids before school. "Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday," she recited, counting off on her fingers while he parted a new section with the comb. "Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday." "You skipped one going back." "I did not." "You did. Try it backward this time." She screwed up her face in concentration, the particular effort of a 7-year-old determined not to lose a game she had invented herself. "Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday." She said it triumphantly, the way she said most things, and Marcus smoothed the second braid down against her shoulder and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. "That's my girl." "Can we do the months next?" "Eat your breakfast first." It was the kind of morning that never made it into any record of his life that mattered to a bank or a lawyer, the kind that left no paper trail and needed none. And it was the one he thought of now, standing on the 3rd floor of Kestrel and Main, with a guard 30 feet behind him, and his daughter's hand tucked into his own again, safer than she had felt 10 minutes earlier. Marcus steadied himself with the memory, the way another man might steady himself with a drink, and let it pass through him without showing on his face. He guided Nia gently toward a bench near the fitting rooms, told her to sit and mind the dresses she liked while he looked at something nearby, and she obeyed without complaint, still a little quieter than she had been an hour ago. He drifted toward a rack of display coats near the men's section, ostensibly killing time, and let his hand fall naturally to the sleeve of a charcoal wool topcoat hanging at the end. His thumb found the shoulder seam and pressed along it, once, the way another man might check a phone out of habit. "That one's a customer favorite," Renee Castillo said, coming around the rack with a stack of folded sweaters in her arms. She had drifted toward him without quite deciding to, some instinct pulling her back to the man from the register. the one Calloway had humiliated in front of half the floor 20 minutes earlier. "We've sold almost the whole first shipment." "You'll be sending most of them back," Marcus said, not unkindly, still running his thumb along the seam. "This one's already starting to give at the shoulder. Feel here." He did not take her hand or presume to guide it. He simply held the seam out slightly and waited. Renee set the sweaters down and pressed 2 fingers where he indicated, frowning, feeling nothing at first, and then, slowly, the faintest give beneath the lining, a looseness that no eye passing the rack would ever have caught. "How did you feel that? It looks perfect." "Looks and holds are 2 different things." Marcus let the sleeve fall back into place. "The stitch counts fine on the surface, but somebody rushed the reinforcement under the arm. Give it 6 weeks on a customer's shoulders and the seam opens. You'll get it back as a return, and by then it'll read as a defect instead of what it is." "Which is?" "A shortcut somebody took to hit a shipping date." She stared at him a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, the stack of sweaters forgotten in her arms. "Where did you learn that?" "I've worked retail for 1.5 years and nobody's ever taught me to check a coat like that." "My father taught me." Marcus said it simply, without embellishment, the kind of answer that closed a door as gently as it had opened one. He did not offer a name. He did not offer a shop, a street, or a year. He let the sentence stand on its own, the way his father had once let a sentence stand, and moved his hand off the coat. He did not tell her about Otis. Otis Reyes had kept the shop 2 doors down from Ezra Bell's tailoring counter for 11 years, a leather man by trade, hands like tanned hide themselves. And he had taken it upon himself, the way older men in a working block sometimes do, to teach the tailor's son things the tailor was too busy to teach him directly. Marcus had been 9, maybe 10, sitting on an overturned crate in Otis's back room while the old man pressed a scrap of hide into his small hands and told him to close his eyes. "Don't look at it, boy. Feel it." "Feel what? It's just leather." "It's never just leather." Otis had guided his fingers along a seam, slow, patient, the smell of tanning oil and old wood thick in that back room. "A machine can sew you a straight line all day long, but your hand will tell you things your eye will miss every time if you let it. Where the tension's wrong, where somebody got lazy, where the material's about to give up on you before it ever shows a crack." He had tapped Marcus's knuckles, not unkindly. "Anybody can look at a thing and see what it wants you to see. Take you longer to learn how to feel what it's hiding. But once you learn it, can't nobody sell you a lie with a straight seam again." Marcus had carried that lesson through 40 years of his life, the way other men carried a piece of scripture, useful in the exact same way, showing up in his hands at odd moments without him ever summoning it on purpose. He glanced back toward the bench where Nia sat swinging her legs, patient, watching a woman try on shoes 2 racks over, and something in his chest loosened slightly at the sight of her safe and still. Up on the mezzanine, Weston Calloway had not stopped watching. He had seen the exchange at the coat rack from 30 feet up, seen the way the man in the gray jacket had lingered with his hand on the merchandise, seen Renee Castillo standing closer to him than store policy strictly required. And none of it read to Calloway as expertise. It read as opportunity. He keyed his radio without taking his eyes off the floor. "Roy, he's got his hands on the stock now. Stay close. I don't like how comfortable he looks." By now, security had trailed a father and daughter through 3 departments and forced him to empty his bag in front of strangers over a scarf that was already paid for. Nobody on that floor could explain why a man who touched nothing without care and raised his voice at no one kept being read as a danger. What none of them knew was that the call about to go out over a store radio was about to reach a lot higher than anyone standing on that floor could imagine. 30 years earlier, on a spring afternoon that had started like any other, 9-year-old Marcus sat on the same overturned crate he always sat on in the back of Bell's Tailoring, watching his father press a customer's trousers with the slow, even rhythm that had never once varied in Marcus's memory. Chalk dust hung in the light from the front window, fine as pollen, settling on the work table in a thin film that Ezra Bell wiped away each evening with the same rag, out of habit more than necessity. A man in a gray suit had come in that morning with papers instead of a suit to be altered, and Ezra had read them standing at his own counter, silent, his shoulders drawing in by degrees, until he looked smaller than Marcus had ever seen him look. By closing, the shears were folded into their cloth for what Marcus did not yet understand was the last time. Ezra wrapped them the way he wrapped a finished garment, careful, exact, no wasted motion, and set the bundle in the bottom of a cardboard box, beside the pressing iron and the bolts of wool nobody had asked him to remove yet. He did not explain it to his son that evening, not fully, not in words a 9-year-old could carry whole. He only said that the building's new owners had decided a shop like his was not the kind of business the block needed anymore, and that decisions like that got made in rooms neither of them would ever be invited into. It happens more than anyone likes to admit. A life's work folded into a box because someone with more leverage decided it should be. A farm sold out from under a family that worked it for 3 generations. A small diner replaced by a chain because a landlord found a better offer. The people who lose those places rarely get an explanation that satisfies them. Only a date by which they are expected to be gone, and a silence afterward that outlasts the anger. Marcus had carried that particular silence with him for 30 years. The sound of his father folding shears into cloth, and he had promised himself, long before he had the means to keep the promise, that no one would ever fold his life into a box on someone else's schedule again. He thought of that afternoon now, standing 3 floors above where his father's shop had once stood, though nothing in his face showed it. Weston Calloway, meanwhile, had reached the end of his patience with a man who would not raise his voice, would not argue, and would not give him the one thing every confrontation like this depended on to justify itself. Calloway had learned in 6 years that most people, guilty or not, cracked eventually under enough attention. This man had not cracked, and the not cracking had begun to feel in Calloway's chest like its own kind of proof. He stepped into the small security alcove behind the men's department and picked up the phone line that connected to the mall's off-duty police detail. The 2 officers who worked weekend shifts patrolling the concourse for exactly this kind of situation. He kept his voice clipped and official, the voice he used in incident reports. "This is Weston Calloway, store manager at Kestrel and Main. I've got a possible shoplifter on the 3rd floor, male, refusing to cooperate with security. He's got a child with him." He paused only long enough to make the lie sound considered rather than invented. "I'd like an officer up here before this escalates further." Nothing in that sentence was true except the location, and Calloway knew it even as he said it, the way a man knows the exact shape of a lie while it is still leaving his mouth, and chooses to let it go anyway, because stopping it now would cost him more than saying it ever could. Nia heard the word before she understood the sentence around it, drifting up from the alcove where Calloway stood with the phone still pressed to his ear. Police. It landed in her the way certain words land in children, stripped of context, carrying only the weight adults have already taught them to attach to it. Her hand found her father's again, and gripped it hard enough that her knuckles went pale against his darker skin. Marcus crouched down to her height without hesitation, unhurried despite the alcove not 15 feet away, and held both her hands in his. "Look at me, baby." He waited until her eyes found his and held there. "We haven't done anything wrong. Not one thing. You understand me?" She nodded, though her chin trembled with the effort of believing it as easily as he said it. He stayed crouched a moment longer, steady, unwilling to let her see anything in his face but calm. And it was in that stillness that the corridor doors at the far end of the floor swung open, admitting a uniformed officer who scanned the department once before Weston Calloway lifted a hand and pointed him straight toward the man kneeling beside his daughter near the fitting rooms.
What I'm struck by is Marcus's choice to let his silence speak for him instead of pulling rank and defending himself, especially in front of his daughter. There's something in that moment that feels like it runs deeper than just staying calm, like it might be about proving something to himself more than to that manager. Would you have told him who you were or kept quiet the way Marcus did? Tell me in the comments.
The officer who stepped through the corridor doors introduced himself as Officer Reyes, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had learned early in his career that most calls like this one were smaller than the person reporting them wanted them to be. He looked between Calloway, Marcus, and the little girl still gripping her father's hand, and something in his face suggested he had already begun measuring the distance between what he was being told and what he was actually seeing. "Sir, can I get your name?" Reyes said to Marcus, notepad open, voice even. "Marcus Bell. And you two are together?" "He's my dad." Nia's voice came out small but certain before Marcus could answer. Calloway stepped in before Reyes could move past it, his tone sharpening. "I'd like to see some proof of that, actually. Anybody can say that." Reyes glanced at him, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, but he did not overrule him outright. He crouched instead, notepad still open, and looked at Nia with the practiced gentleness of a man trained to talk to children without frightening them further, unaware that the gentleness itself would not undo the damage of the question underneath it. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your daddy's whole name, first and last?" The badge on his chest caught the overhead light as he shifted his weight, a small gleam that snagged Nia's eye and held it. And for a moment, she could not find her own voice at all. Every adult around her had gone quiet, waiting, and the quiet pressed down on her harder than any of the noise had. Her chin trembled. She looked up at her father instead of the officer, searching his face for permission to answer a question that should never have needed asking. And when she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the middle of it. "Marcus Bell," she swallowed. "That's my daddy's name." Almost everyone carries a memory of being disbelieved about something that was never in question to begin with. A teacher who assumed the wrong student cheated. A coach who doubted an injury that turned out to be real. A room full of adults trusting a badge or a title over the plain truth standing in front of them. It rarely announces itself as cruelty in the moment. It just quietly teaches a person, often young, that being right is sometimes not enough to be believed. Nia had just learned that lesson standing in a department store on her own birthday weekend, and no one in that crowd, not even the officer trying to be kind about it, could give it back to her once it landed. Renee Castillo had watched the whole exchange from behind her register with her stomach in a knot. And when the little girl's voice cracked on her own father's name, something in Renee finally broke loose from wherever she had been holding it. She stepped out from behind the counter, leaving a half-folded stack of sweaters behind her, and walked straight up to Officer Reyes. "I was at the register during the bag search," she said. "I saw everything he had. It was a scarf and a receipt. Nothing from this store's floor. He didn't take anything, and he hasn't done anything since except stand here and let your manager make a scene out of nothing." Calloway rounded on her immediately. "Renee, get back to your station. This isn't your concern." "It became my concern when you scared a little girl in front of half this floor. I said get back to your register, or I will write you up for leaving your post during an active incident." Calloway's voice had gone tight and low. The voice of a man who understood on some buried level that the ground beneath him had started to shift and was trying to hold it in place through sheer volume of authority. He turned half toward Reyes, half toward the small crowd that had not dispersed, and let his frustration slip past whatever restraint had been holding it back. "Some people just don't belong in a room like this, and it's not Renee's job to decide who does." A woman near the shoe display, phone already raised to film the officer's arrival, caught the line clean on her recording, Calloway's voice sharp and carrying across the department, and lowered her phone slightly afterward, as if she needed a second to be sure she had actually heard it. If this story is touching your heart, like the video and tell me in the comments what you would have done standing in that crowd. Officer Reyes closed his notepad slowly, looked from the scarf receipt still sitting untouched on the counter to the little girl now pressed silent against her father's side, and turned back to Calloway with the flat, careful tone of a man who had just realized he'd been called in to enforce someone else's grudge. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "what exactly are the grounds here?"
Because so far, I'm not seeing a crime. I'm seeing a receipt, a scarf, and a kid who's scared half to death.
Calloway opened his mouth to answer, and for the first time since the man in the gray jacket had walked through his doors that morning, nothing came out. Calloway did not answer the officer's question with words. He turned his tablet toward Reyes instead, thumb swiping quickly to a screen he had built in the seconds while nobody was watching him. A loss prevention alert he populated on the spot with a description vague enough to fit half the men who had walked through his doors that year. Gray jacket, male, loitering near high-value merchandise. He held it up like evidence pulled from a drawer rather than typed in front of a room full of witnesses, and Reyes studied it with the particular discomfort of a man who suspected he was being handed a prop but had no clean way to prove it yet. "Let's take this to the office," Reyes said finally, more to diffuse the crowd than to endorse Calloway's claim. "Sort it out properly, away from all these people." To the shopper still lingering near the register, to the mother who had pulled her son back earlier, to the woman with her phone still in her hand, it did not read as sorting anything out properly. It read as an arrest. A father in a gray jacket walked toward a back office flanked by a guard and an officer, and that image settled into the memory of everyone watching long before anyone learned a single fact that might have complicated it. "Nia, sweetheart, come here with me," Renee said quickly, crouching to catch the little girl before she could follow her father through the door. Nia resisted for a moment, small hand still stretched toward Marcus, and then let herself be pulled gently against Renee's side, watching her father disappear down the corridor. "Why do they keep following my daddy?" Nia asked again, sharper this time, the softness of the first question in the fitting room gone out of her voice entirely. She looked up at Renee like she expected finally a real answer, the kind adults were supposed to have ready for exactly this moment. Renee opened her mouth and found nothing honest enough to give a 7-year-old. She could not say it was because of the color of his skin, though she suspected that was closer to true than anything Calloway would ever admit on paper.
She could not say it was because Calloway had decided, the moment he laid eyes on him, that a man like that did not belong in a room like this. She settled for the only thing she could offer without lying to a child who had already been lied to enough for one morning. "I don't think they should be, sweetheart. I really don't." In the back office, Calloway shut the door behind Marcus with more force than the moment required and dropped into the chair behind his desk like a man reclaiming ground. "I need to see some ID," he said. "You have my name," Marcus said. His voice had not changed since the fitting room, still level, still without edge. "That's what the officer asked for, and I gave it. That's not enough. Not with an unverified minor and an unverified identity." Marcus did not reach for a wallet. He did not offer an explanation, a title, a reason Calloway should already know better than to ask this question the way he was asking it. He simply stood where he was, hands loosely at his sides, and let the silence answer for him. Because he had learned decades ago that a man defending himself to someone determined not to believe him only feeds the determination. Calloway read that stillness the only way he knew how to read anything that resisted him. He read it as guilt. "Cuff him," he said to Roy Voss, who stood by the door with the flat discomfort of a man executing an order he did not fully agree with. "Pending identity verification. It's mall policy when we can't confirm who we're dealing with." Reyes hesitated, one hand half raised as if to object. But the policy Calloway cited was real enough on paper, however rarely it was invoked for a man who had produced a name, a receipt, and a daughter who had already answered every question asked of her. Voss stepped forward with the cuffs, apology written into the set of his shoulders even as his hands did the job Calloway had told him to do, and the metal closed cold and sudden around Marcus's wrists. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He stood with his arms drawn slightly behind him and looked straight ahead at the wall. And something in that posture, upright, unbroken, made even Voss glance away first. A second guard ran gloved hands along the inside of Marcus's coat, methodical, searching pockets that held nothing but a folded receipt, and in the left one, the small brass weight that had ridden against his ribs since morning. The guard drew it out and turned it over in his palm, frowning at it like a man trying to decide whether a stone was a weapon, the worn brass catching the office light, the leather straps soft with 40 years of handling. "What is this?" the guard asked, holding it up for Calloway to see, as if it might be the very proof they had been chasing all morning. Marcus watched it dangle from the guard's fingers and said nothing, though something in his chest tightened harder than the cuffs ever could. Through the narrow window set into the office door, he caught one last glimpse of Renee leading Naya down the corridor by the hand, his daughter's face turned back over her shoulder toward the glass, before the two of them rounded the corner and disappeared from view. And it was in that exact moment, cuffed, watching his own child vanish down a hallway in a building that did not yet know his name, that the front desk phone out on the sales floor began to ring with a call nobody in that office had any idea was coming. Marcus sat in the hard plastic chair with his hands cuffed behind him, back straight, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Calloway's shoulder, and let his mind go where it always went, when his body had nowhere else to go. He thought of his father folding the shears into their cloth, slow, exact, no wasted motion even in defeat. And he matched his own breathing to the rhythm of that memory, until the metal at his wrist stopped feeling like the only thing in the room. The tape measure sat in a shallow plastic tray on the desk between them, logged now as an item of interest, its brass casing dull under the office's fluorescent light. Nobody in that room understood what they were looking at. To them, it was an unidentified object pulled from a suspect's coat. To Marcus, it was the last steady hand he could still feel guiding his own, and watching it sit there under a stranger's scrutiny cost him more than the cuffs did. Down the hall, in a small alcove near customer service, Naya sat on a low bench with her knees drawn up, Renee beside her with an arm loose around her shoulders.
The little girl had gone quiet for several minutes, the kind of quiet that worried Renee more than crying would have. And when she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper.
"Is my daddy going to jail?"
"No, sweetheart. Absolutely not."
"Is it because I wanted the dress? Because I made us come here?"
Her chin crumpled on the last word, the full weight of a 7-year-old's logic pressing down on her. The private arithmetic children do when the world goes wrong around them, and they cannot find any explanation except themselves. Renee pulled her closer, throat tight. "This is not your fault. Not one piece of it. Your daddy did nothing wrong today, and neither did you. And I promise you that dress had nothing to do with any of it." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because certainty was the only thing she had left to give. And a child in that state needed it far more than she needed the truth of how frightened Renee actually was for both of them. Back in the office, Calloway had already picked up his desk phone, dialing his district supervisor with the loose, satisfied energy of a man calling in good news. He kept his voice low enough that Marcus could hear only fragments, but the fragments were enough. "Handled it clean. No real pushback. Officer backed us on policy." He rehearsed the story as he told it, smoothing the parts that would not survive close inspection, already imagining how it would read in next month's regional shrink report, a line item that made him look vigilant instead of what he actually was. He did not once mention the scarf. He did not mention the receipt, or the child's cracking voice, or the fact that the man sitting cuffed 6 feet away from him had not raised his voice a single time all morning. In Calloway's telling, none of that belonged in the story, because none of it fit the shape he needed the story to have. 3 floors above them, the elevator doors opened onto the top level of Kestrel and Main with a soft chime, and Denise Okafor stepped out first, garment bag over one arm, tablet tucked under the other, trailed by 2 members of the store's ownership board, who had flown in that morning specifically for the walkthrough that had been sitting on the calendar for a month. Denise had worked as Marcus Bell's executive assistant for going on 6 years, long enough to know his habits down to the minute. And she scanned the corridor out of pure reflex, expecting to find him already waiting near the executive office, the way he always was on days like this, coffee in hand, 10 minutes early out of a lifelong discomfort with being late. He was not there. "He's usually already parked by now," she said to the board members, more to herself than to them, glancing at her watch. "Give me 1 second." She pulled out her phone and opened the thread where Marcus texted her every time he arrived on site. A habit so consistent she could set a clock by it. 3 words. On site. All good. Set within minutes of walking through any door that belonged to him. The thread sat unanswered beneath her last message from that morning, confirming the walkthrough time. No reply beneath it. No gray bubble showing him typing. Nothing at all. Denise frowned at the screen, thumb hovering over the call button, unaware that 2 floors below her, the man she was trying to reach sat handcuffed in a back office, his own name still meaning nothing to anyone in that room. Denise had asked a passing associate where the store's security office was located, tracking the small blue dot on her phone's location share to a corridor behind customer service. And she pushed through the door mid-sentence, garment bag still over her arm, expecting an ordinary delay, and finding instead a man she had worked beside for 6 years, sitting in handcuffs under fluorescent light. She stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 beat, long enough to take in the cuffs, the tray on the desk, the officer, the guard. Calloway standing behind his own desk, like a man still convinced he had done something right. Then her voice cut through the room, clear and carrying, pitched for every person standing in it, and the small crowd that had gathered just outside the open door. "Mr. Bell, sir, are you all right?" The room did not move for a moment. Calloway's mouth opened and then simply stopped, the color draining out of his face the way water leaves a basin, fast and total. He had spent the last hour building a story in his head where he was the one protecting something. And Denise's 4 words had just knocked the entire foundation out from under it in front of 2 board members who had flown in that morning specifically to walk this store with the man now sitting cuffed in his own security office. "I'm fine, Denise," Marcus said, his voice as level as it had been all morning. No triumph in it, no edge. "Tell them who signs the walkthrough authorization." "Mr. Bell owns this store, officer." Denise turned to Reyes, businesslike, unhurried, laying out the fact the way she might lay out a quarterly report. "He owns the holding company that owns this building and 11 others in the region. He does unannounced floor visits every few months, and I have never once had to explain that to anyone standing in a uniform before today." Outside the office door, the small crowd that had trailed the story all morning began to understand, in pieces, and then all at once, exactly what they had been watching. The woman who had filmed Calloway's line about people not belonging in a room like this lowered her phone slightly, staring at the screen as if it had just told her something new. A man near the back of the group let out a low whistle, disbelieving, the kind of sound people make when a picture finally resolves into focus. Phones that had been raised out of simple curiosity stayed raised now for a different reason entirely, and a hush moved through the small crowd, the way word moves through a room before anyone has actually said it out loud. There is a particular kind of chill that runs through a group of strangers the moment they realize they watched something important happen and did not know it while it was happening. A soldier they mocked in line who turns out to be a decorated veteran. A quiet coworker revealed as the one who built the company from nothing. The recognition rearranges everything a person thought they understood about the last hour, and it rarely arrives gently. Officer Reyes was already moving before Denise finished speaking, keys out, uncuffing Marcus with hands that had gone quick and careful, in a way they had not been 10 minutes earlier. "Mr. Bell, I am sorry, genuinely. This should not have gone the way it went, and I take responsibility for the part I played in it." Marcus rubbed one wrist and then the other, unhurried, and looked at the officer with something closer to understanding than anger. "You asked reasonable questions. Somebody handed you the wrong answers to build them on." He did not raise his voice at Calloway. He did not turn to look at him at all. He simply said, quiet, direct, the only thing that mattered to him in that room, "I need someone to bring my daughter back." Renee had already turned the corner with Nia the moment word reached her that the cuffs had come off, and the little girl broke into a run the second she saw her father standing free on his own 2 feet, sprinting the last stretch of corridor and throwing both arms around his waist so hard it nearly staggered him. He crouched immediately, folding around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the whole room falling quiet around the two of them in a way that felt, for the first time all morning, like relief instead of fear. On the desk behind them, forgotten by everyone in the room except the man who had just been reunited with his daughter, the small brass tape measure sat untouched in its evidence tray, and it was reaching for it, rather than for any of the apology still gathering in the room, that told everyone watching exactly who Marcus Bell really was. But what happened next, once he finally spoke Weston Calloway's name out loud, was the part nobody in that store would forget for a long time. By early afternoon, word had already moved through the sales floor the way word moves through any building full of people who sense a shift before anyone confirms it out loud. And one of the board members who had flown in that morning gathered the staff near the escalators to say it plainly, rather than let rumor do the job badly. Weston Calloway had been relieved of his position, effective immediately, under the store's own written conduct policy, the same policy that governed how every employee, manager included, was expected to treat a customer on the floor. Nobody framed it as punishment for the man specifically. They framed it as the policy simply doing what it had always been written to do, applied for once to the person who was supposed to enforce it. In the small office off the security corridor, Roy Voss sat alone for a while after the announcement, turning his radio over in his hands, the way a man turns over a decision he wishes he had made differently that morning. Denise found him there an hour later, going through the motions of a shift report nobody had asked him to file yet, and she did not come to reprimand him. "You did what he told you to do," she said, leaning against the door frame. "That's not the same as doing it right. But Mr. Bell asked me to make sure you understood the difference matters to him." "I put cuffs on a man who never gave me a reason to," Roy said, not looking up. 20 years on this job, and I let a title talk me out of my own eyes." "Then use that." Denise's voice stayed even, neither soft nor sharp. "We're rewriting the security training module this month, top to bottom, starting with when an alert actually justifies detaining somebody, instead of when a manager just doesn't like the look of them. Mr. Bell wants someone on that committee who's felt exactly what today cost, not someone reading it off a slide." Roy looked up at that, surprised to be handed a second chance rather than a box for his own desk. He said nothing for a moment, then nodded once, the closest thing to a promise a man like him tended to make out loud. Renee had braced herself for a very different meeting when Denise asked her to step into the executive office an hour later, certain she was about to be reprimanded for leaving her register during an active incident, the exact threat Calloway had thrown at her in front of the whole floor. Instead, Denise closed the door gently and thanked her, plainly, for being the only person on that floor willing to say out loud what she had seen with her own eyes. "We're launching a management training cohort next quarter," Denise said. "Mr. Bell asked me to make sure your name was the first one on the list." Renee sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way a person turns over news too good to trust immediately, and found she had no answer polished enough for the occasion. So she gave the honest one instead. "I almost didn't say anything. I want you to know that. I was scared of exactly what he threatened me with." "Almost didn't matters a lot less than did," Denise said, and left it there. Before he collected Nia from the lounge, Marcus stopped back in the security office one last time, alone, and lifted the small brass tape measure out of the evidence tray where it had sat all afternoon, forgotten by everyone in that building except him. He turned it once in his palm, thumb finding the same worn groove it always found, and slid it back into his coat pocket where it belonged. Nobody in that room had ever known what they were holding. He did not need them to. By the next morning, the clip a bystander had filmed near the shoe display had traveled far beyond the mall it was recorded in, shared and reshared until it reached people who had never set foot in Kestrel and Maine and never would. Each new viewer arriving at Calloway's line about people not belonging in a room like this with fresh outrage, as if hearing it for the first time themselves. Regional offices for retailers with no connection to the store at all began circulating it internally as a cautionary example in loss prevention training, a case study in exactly the kind of assumption their own policies were supposed to guard against. Inside the mall's management company, a formal review opened into the off-duty police contract that had let a store manager summon an officer on nothing more than a hunch and an unverified alert. The first real scrutiny that arrangement had faced in years. None of it required Marcus to say a word publicly. The footage did what his silence in that office had always been quietly building toward, though he had never once orchestrated it or wished for the exposure. He would have preferred, if asked, that none of it had ever needed to happen at all. In the family lounge down the hall, Nia sat curled on a small couch with a cup of apple juice someone had brought her, feet tucked under her, watching the door for her father the way she had watched it all morning. When he finally stepped through it, she did not run this time. She simply held her arms up, and he crossed the room and lifted her onto his lap. And for a while, neither of them said anything about badges or bags or scarves at all. "Did I still get my dress?" she asked eventually, small and hopeful, the birthday mission not forgotten even after everything else. "We'll go pick it out together. Just the two of us, whenever you're ready." "Not today?" "Not today," he agreed, resting his chin lightly on the top of her head. "Today, we just go home." Calloway was packing the contents of his desk into a cardboard box that afternoon. The same unglamorous ritual that ends most careers regardless of how they began. When Marcus passed the open office door on his way to collect his daughter's coat from the lounge closet. Calloway looked up, and for a moment neither man moved. "Mr. Bell." Calloway's voice had lost every trace of the authority it carried that morning. "I'm sorry. For all of it. I got it wrong, and I know saying that now doesn't undo what your daughter went through." Marcus studied him for a beat. No anger left visible in his face. No warmth in it either. He gave a single small nod, neutral, final. The kind of gesture that acknowledged the words without accepting any obligation to answer them further. And then he turned and continued down the hallway, toward the room where his daughter was waiting for him. 2 days later, A claims adjuster reviewing the store's insurance file flagged the loss prevention alert Calloway had fabricated on his tablet that morning. An entry with no supporting incident number, no prior pattern, and no basis in any actual theft, and opened a liability review that would sit in the file long after the immediate story had stopped trending, waiting quietly for the day some future employer ran a background check and found out exactly what kind of manager they were about to hire. The drive home had been quiet, the box with the birthday dress riding on the back seat beside Nia, her fingers resting on its lid the whole way, as if she needed to confirm every few minutes that it was still there. When they pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on, timed the way Marcus always set it before they left in the mornings, and Nia carried the box inside herself, insisting, refusing his offer to help, even though it was nearly as wide as she was. She set it on the kitchen table while he warmed dinner, and for a while the two of them worked in a comfortable, ordinary silence, plates and glasses and the low hum of the stove filling in for words neither of them needed yet. Nia lifted the lid once, just to look, smoothing a hand over the pale yellow fabric and the sash she had wanted to touch that morning and never had the chance to, and then closed it again gently, saving it, the way she saved the good parts of things for later.
"Wash your hands," Marcus told her, sliding a plate across the table, and she went and came back and climbed into her chair, and for those few minutes the kitchen held nothing but the shape of an ordinary evening, the kind neither of them would have thought to be grateful for 24 hours earlier. The kitchen held the particular quiet of a day finally set down, the birthday dress boxed and ribboned on the chair beside the table, its tissue paper still crackling faintly every time Nia shifted in her seat. She had eaten most of her dinner in silence, unusual for her, and when she finally spoke, she asked the question plainly, the same one she had carried through 3 floors of that store that morning. "Why were they following us, Daddy? Really?" Marcus set his fork down and looked at her. And this time he did not crouch to her level or promise her it wasn't her fault, because both of those had already been said and both were already true. This time she deserved the whole answer. "Some people decide who you are before they know one single thing about you," he said. "They see a jacket or a face, or the way somebody walks into a room and they make up their mind right there, before you've said a word. That's what happened today. Nothing about it was true and nothing about it was fair." "Then how do you stop it?" "You don't. Not always. Not by yourself." He reached across and covered her small hand with his. "What you can do is keep being exactly who you are anyway. Steady, honest, kind, even when somebody's being none of those things to you. That's the only answer that's ever worked for me. And it worked today, too, even when it didn't feel like it in the moment." Nia sat with that for a while, turning it over the way she turned over most things, quietly and completely. And then she nodded, satisfied in the way only a child fully trusted can be satisfied. Marcus reached into his coat, hanging now on the back of his chair, and drew out the small brass tape measure that had ridden in that pocket since morning, since years before that morning, since a back room thick with chalk dust and the smell of pressed wool. He turned it once in his palm and then set it gently into her open hands. "This was your grandfather Ezra's," he said. "He was a tailor, a good one, better than anybody gave him credit for while he was alive. This is the only thing of his I have left. I want you to have it now." He thought for a moment of the first time his own father had put that same tape measure into his hands, some 30 years earlier, in the back room that smelled of tanning oil and pressed wool. Marcus had been small then too, and Ezra had knelt beside him the way Marcus now sat beside his daughter, guiding his son's fingers along the brass edge with the patience of a man who believed a lesson worth teaching was worth teaching slowly. "Don't just look at the number, son," Ezra had told him. "Anybody can read a number. Feel where the fabric pulls, where it gives. A measurement that's honest tells you the truth about a thing, whether you want to hear it or not. Man who ignores that ends up building on a lie he can't see." He had closed his son's small hand around the tape measure then, the same brass now resting in Nia's palm, and said nothing more, letting the weight of the thing speak for itself the way he always did. Marcus had carried that lesson through the loss of his father's shop, through decades of building something quiet and lasting out of nothing anyone handed him, through cuffs on his wrists that morning that had not once managed to shake it loose. She held it carefully. The way she held things she understood mattered without yet understanding why, running her thumb along the worn brass edge exactly the way she had watched him do 100 times, without either of them ever naming it. "Is it magic?" "No, baby. It's just steady. It only ever measures what's really there, not what somebody wants to believe is there. That's rarer than magic, most days." He watched her weigh that, 7 years old and already carrying more of the day's truth than most adults would ever be asked to hold. And something in his chest settled, the way it had not settled since he first heard the word police drift down that hallway that morning. "One day," he said, "this store, and every person walking through it, is going to know your name the same way they know mine now. Not because you'll have to fight for it the way today made it feel, because you'll have earned it, quietly, the way your grandfather did, the way I try to." I hope you enjoyed that story. Like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Later, on the couch, the tape measure caught the low kitchen light where it sat loose in Nia's fingers, brass warm and dull against the cushion, and her breathing slowed into sleep against her father's arm, before the evening news had even finished. Marcus sat still beside her, unwilling to move and wake her. The whole house settled quiet around them both. But Marcus Bell's story was only the first floor of what Kestrel and Maine was still hiding. Some names take a lifetime to be believed.
The thing that got to me was watching Marcus refuse to become the villain in someone else's story. He has the power, the proof, the righteous anger everyone's handing him on a plate, and instead he goes home with his daughter and gives her his grandfather's tape measure. That choice, that quiet refusal to let this day make him small the way it tried to make him small, is what I keep thinking about. Would you have had the strength to walk away like that, or would you need something more? Tell me in the comments.